Thanks, Brock. So last week we looked at the winter stage of life, and it's a stage that a lot of times we don't want to go into. We feel like it's maybe not a good stage where we're not as productive for the Lord, but we draw some conclusions last time that maybe it's actually a very good stage of life. You know, we talked about grandkids and what a blessing they are. You know, you love your kids more than anybody in the world, and then when they have kids, I think the blessing is just, you can't describe that. And I remember telling you guys a story about a lady who said, "I love being 60." And she truly did. She was having a ball. We talked about, sometimes in that stage of life, you have a little more resources than you did. You maybe step into the role of a mentor and have a different role than maybe you had before. And so we have an influence on people. I think little kids and old people sometimes have a real connection. They have a different perspective. Sometimes the world is very small, isn't it? I mean, I have to get to do what I want to do today, and it's very important to me. And as same as a little kid who maybe they don't think about 10 years from now. They think about right now and having fun right now. And I think when we get older, that's how we think, isn't it? We don't make plans 20 years in advance like you do when you're maybe 20 years old, because that's not the perspective you have. I worked with a guy years ago and he got fired, and I was talking to him and he was packing his box up, with his stuff. We worked in an office, and I said, you're in a field that's very sought after, and you're probably going to have a lot of, headhunters calling you, and you can easily get another job in this field. And he said, "Zach, I don't want another hard job like this at this stage in my life." And he said, "What you're going to find is," because he was much older than me, he said, "in every 10 years, your goals are going to change." And that's exactly what has happened. We have a different perspective, and kiddos, grandchildren are such a blessing, and I think a grandparent has such an influence. It's not like any other relative, Your parent has the job of daily tasks, keeping you, on task, doing the right thing, having the right direction. But a grandparent has such a different perspective. They have the long-term goal of just loving that person and hoping they get to heaven, and such a wonderful time. You're not in the battle anymore in that stage, are we? We looked at Elijah, and remember, he went from summer when he's staring down the prophets of Baal, and they're just, he's right in the battle, to a period of depression in the valley of Kidron, right? And then he goes and has a different role, and then brings up Elisha and kind of mentors him. And so we see him go from summer to winter, just all in one story almost. And we drew some conclusions about that, and one of them is that any stage of life can be a time when we serve God. I mean, any stage of life is a time when we can have enormous influence on others. And Elijah's influence on Elisha was fantastic. And you remember what he said, "I want a double portion of your spirit." And God gave him that. He did twice as many miracles that we record in the Bible, that we read about. So our role is vital, even in that stage of life. We talked about how, we sometimes give in to fear as we go into that stage of life. Maybe feel like we're not as influential, but that's not the case. And in fact, it's the exact opposite. We have so much to draw from as we go into the winter stage of our life. And so I want to look today at Eli. Eli is a person who I think mentored in spite of his weaknesses, and that's I think maybe a danger as we go into the winter stage of our life. We look at maybe our failings and some mistakes we made with the idea that disqualifies me now from serving as a mentor for anybody. And it's not the case. Let's look 1 Samuel chapter 1, and we'll start in verse 24. 1 Samuel 1, starting at verse 24. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When they had slaughtered the bull, they brought the boy Eli, and she said to him, "As surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord there." Let's drop down to chapter 2, verse 11. Hannah goes into a song there that she's so happy about it. Verse 11, "Then Elkanah went home to Ramah, but the boy ministered before the Lord under Eli the priest." So we know that story, don't we? Hannah wanted a child, and she couldn't have one. She prayed to the Lord, and God blessed her with a child. And she promised the Lord that she would give that son to God, and she did that. She delivered him to Eli, and he served Eli as a helper, as a sort of a training, I guess. Eli could have said, "I'm not qualified to be a mentor. I've made these mistakes with my family." We're going to read about that in just a minute. Sometimes we think our mistakes disqualify us, and especially as we go into the older years of our lives. We look back maybe and our kids aren't faithful. I even heard a preacher say one time, if your kids aren't faithful, you've failed as a Christian. And I thought, that is so wrong. That is so wrong. Has the Lord failed if we turn away? No. We can't put that kind of requirement on ourselves. God doesn't. And certainly, I think it's a tendency sometimes. I knew a deacon years ago, and he stepped down. He was a great deacon. He had a lot of compassion, a lot of love for people. And you could see him just talking to people. He was affectionate. He cared about people. He spent a lot of time serving. And then he stepped down. And I asked him, I said, "Why did you step out of the deacon role? You were doing a great job." And he said, "Well, for a lot of reasons." He said, "But one," he said, "my kids aren't what they ought to be." And I thought that was sort of a weak excuse, because I knew his kids. They were grown, so for one thing, they were not under his roof. And I don't know to what extent, you want to carry that idea of having faithful children. They were no longer children. They were adults out of his home. Now, he had lost the influence as a parent in that role. And secondly, they lived in a different town. They were not an influence to anybody in this area. In my mind, he was completely scripturally authorized to serve as a deacon still. And yet, he gave that up. And I'm not sure that was really his reason. That's what he told me. But I think he felt maybe like he was inadequate. Maybe he had failed in some way. And we're going to watch Eli do good, even though maybe he had some failings. Let's start reading again in chapter 2. Let's see. Let's just start in chapter 2, starting in verse 12. Eli's sons were wicked men. They had no regard for the Lord. Now it was the practice of the priests with the people that whenever anyone offered a sacrifice, and while the meat was being boiled, the servant of the priest would come with a 3-pronged fork in his hand. He would plunge it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot, and the priest would take it for himself, whatever the fork brought up. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. But even before the fat was burned, the servant of the priest would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, "Give the priest some meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, but only raw." If the man said to him, "Let the fat be burned up first, and then take whatever you want," the servant would answer, "No, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force." This sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. But Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. Each year his mother made him a little robe, and he took it to him when she went up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife, saying, "May the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord." Then they would go home. And the Lord was gracious to Hannah. She conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. What does that remind you of, that phrase? So, does anybody's version have something different than grew up in the presence of the Lord? Does anybody have something like you grew in stature, that sort of thing? Okay. Beg your pardon? Okay, we're coming to it. Verse 22, now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So he said to them, why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons, it is not good report that I hear spreading among the Lord's people. If a man sins against another man, God may mediate for him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him? His sons, however, did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. And the boy Samuel continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and with men. There it is. What does that remind you of? Jesus. Yeah, we read that same phrase. Okay, verse 27. Now a man of God came to Eli and said to him, this is what the Lord says. Did I not clearly reveal myself to your father's house when they were in Egypt under Pharaoh? I chose your father out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, and to wear an ephod in my presence. I also gave your father's house all the offerings made with fire by the Israelites. Why do you scorn my sacrifice and offering that I prescribed for my dwelling? Why do you honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choice part of every offering made by the people Israel? So that's a reference, I think, to that three-pronged fork going into the meat in the pot. Verse 30, therefore the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promised that your house and your father's house would minister before me forever, but now the Lord declares, far be it from me. Those who honor me I will honor, but those who despise me will be disdained. The time is coming when I will cut short your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your family line, and you will see the distress in my dwelling. Although good will be done to Israel in your family line, there will never be an old man. Every one of you that I do not cut off from my altar will be spared only to blind your eyes with tears and to grieve your heart, and all your descendants will die in the prime of life. Man, that sounds severe, doesn't it? God is very displeased. Verse 34, and what happens to your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, will be a sign to you. They will both die on the same day. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what is in my heart and mind. I will firmly establish his house. He will minister before my anointed one always. Then everyone left in your family line will come and bow down before him for a piece of silver and a crust of bread and plead, appoint me to some priestly office so that I can have food to eat. Okay, let's keep reading. Starting in chapter 3. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There was not many visions. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark was. And then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, here I am. And he ran to Eli and said, here I am. You called me. But Eli said, I did not call. Go back and lie down. So he went and lay down. Again the Lord called Samuel, and Samuel got up and went to Eli. He said, here I am, you called me. My son, Eli said, I did not call you. Go back and lie down. People that think there's no humor in the Bible, that to me that's funny. This kid is going in and waking this old man up, and he tells him, go back and lay down. That's not me. I didn't call you. Verse 7, now Samuel did not know that the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. Verse 8, the Lord called Samuel a third time, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, here I am, you called me. Then Eli realized the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling at the other time, Samuel, Samuel. And then Samuel said, speak, for your servant is listening. And the Lord said to Samuel, see, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears it tingle. At the time I will carry it out against Eli everything I spoke against the family from the beginning to end, for I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons made themselves contemptible, and he failed to restrain them. Some versions, I think, say, restrained him not. That just sort of that severe statement. Therefore, I swore to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering. Samuel lay down until morning and then opened the doors of the house of the Lord. He was afraid to tell Eli the vision. But Eli called him and said, Samuel, my son. And Samuel answered, Here I am. What was it he said to you? Eli asked. Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide from me anything he told you. To me, that sounds scary. He's getting in his face, and you better not hold back anything. Verse 18, so Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from him. And then Eli said, He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes. The Lord was with Samuel, and he grew up, and he let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. I notice he was not a priest, right? He was not from the tribe of Levi, but nonetheless a prophet. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word. So if you are Eli, and you have this going on, your kids are living very unfaithfully, and they are ashamed of your family. And now some, innocent young lady comes with her baby and gives him to you and says, we want you to raise him in the nurturing admonition of the Lord. Do you feel qualified? Knowing that your sons are out there living immorally and knowing that they are not doing what God would want them to do? I don't think so. I think, we don't read of it, but there's a good chance that Eli may have felt like, I'm not qualified to mentor anybody. And if we're not careful, I think that is the devil's tool against us. We don't feel good enough to serve. If this was going on with an elder, what do you think would happen? What do you think the congregation would do if a preacher, had kids living that way? Man, they would not allow him to continue serving in that role. And as I said, the deacon, that stepped down, he just didn't feel like he could keep going, even though his kids were, I think, probably living okay. They may not have been that faithful, or maybe they needed some strengthening and growth, but he stepped down as a result of that. This sin of what they're doing with the sacrifice, look at Leviticus, kind of put your finger there, I guess, and look at Leviticus chapter 3. There was a prescribed way that they were to offer that sacrifice. Leviticus chapter 3. Leviticus chapter 3, starting in verse 1. If someone's offering a fellowship offering, and he offers an animal from the herd, whether male or female, he is to present before the Lord an animal without defect. He is to lay his hand on the head of his offering and slaughter it at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Then Aaron's son, the priest, shall sprinkle the blood against the altar on all sides. From the fellowship offering, he is to bring a sacrifice made to the Lord by fire. All the fat that covers the inner parts or is connected to them, both kidneys and the fat on the near the loins, and covering of the liver, which he will remove from the kidneys. Then Aaron's sons are to burn it on the altar on top of the burnt offering that is on the burning wood, as an offering made by fire, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. Okay, and let's look at Leviticus chapter 7. Leviticus chapter 7, about verse 15. Leviticus 7, verse 15. The meat of this fellowship offering of thanksgiving must be eaten on the day it is offered. He must leave none of it till morning. If, however, his offering is in the result of a vow or a free will offering, the sacrifice shall be eaten on the day he offers it, but anything left over may be eaten on the next day. Any meat of the sacrifice left over till the third day must be burned up. If any meat or the fellowship offering is eaten on the third day, it will not be accepted. It will not be credited to the one who offered it, for it is impure. The person who eats any of it will be held responsible. So God had a plan exactly how he wanted that sacrifice to be offered. They roasted it, and then they ate it, and they could eat it maybe the next day if it was a result of a free will offering. And to the extent that they were doing that correctly, Eli's sons would come, and I think the context of that is that they were stealing that from the offerer. Maybe the person offering the sacrifice, was cooking the meat at home to eat it, as they were told, and Eli's sons maybe went there and took it by force and threatened them. So these are guys that are using their father's position to extort food from the people. And it seems like a small thing. It's just a food, but it was a corruption of worship. And it was a corruption of what God had commanded. And so this made God very angry. You're showing contempt. I think it would be akin today with us maybe treating the Lord's Supper with contempt. Just maybe substituting coffee or something for whatever. I mean, it's whatever I want, right? And that's kind of what it seems like with them. And then this idea of sleeping with the women at the tent of meeting. The women at the tent of the meeting, there's a lot of discussion about, were these ministerial type roles? If you look at Exodus chapter 38 and verse 8, it talks about the women at the tent of the meeting, and that they were given mirrors made of bronze. So they had some kind of role, I think, in serving at the tent. And some scholars have looked at that and said, how could Eli's sons be, seduce a woman who was devoted to the Lord in that role, and maybe drawn the conclusion that they weren't necessarily servants of the tent, but maybe they had, or at least Eli's sons maybe had corrupted it to some sort of shrine prostitute role, like the pagan nations did. That was how they worshiped their pagan god, wasn't it? You had this meal. A lot of times you would get drunk, and then you had a shrine prostitute, and that was worship, right, to the pagan god. Whatever it was adultery, and God was very displeased, wasn't he? And the fact that Eli knew about it and didn't restrain them is, to me, sort of speaks to his maybe his passiveness, maybe his lack of the ability to control. Not a good leader in our eyes, and yet the Lord allowed him to lead. I drew a blank. Yeah, so let him stay in that role. Now, so what do you think that he should have done? I mean, obviously he should have corrected those children. But the idea that he was not qualified to serve, have you ever known anybody that maybe didn't want to serve because they didn't feel adequate? I mean, they didn't feel like they were qualified. Eli, notice some things about Eli that I think are really pretty good, even though his raising of his children was not good. He did not stop serving as a priest. I think the devil's tool, as I said, we often give up on serving God altogether if we're not perfect, and if our family isn't perfect. And he didn't refuse to mentor Samuel. Now, he could have turned down Hannah's request, could he not? I mean, he could have said, I'm not really qualified. And another thing he didn't do, I think is very telling, he didn't rebel against God's judgment. You remember God, in this, we read earlier, God severely chastised him and punished his family. And Eli, I think, takes that without any sort of rebel. He doesn't rebel against that. He accepts God's judgment against his family. You can compare that to Saul. who, when told he's going to lose the kingdom, what does he try to do? He tries to kill David. He goes after the person that's going to come after him. We don't see that in Eli. In fact, we see him, sort of mentoring. We see him mentoring. I'm drawing a blank. Okay, so let's look. So any questions? Anything you thought about with this idea of being a servant, being a mentor, even in our later years, in spite of our failings? Anybody have a thought or question you want to offer? Yes.
Where it says, therefore, my beloved, have always obeyed God and my presence only. But now much after forgotten salvation. Sometimes I feel like I can only be responsible. Even though I do have, and I need to bring them up there a little now. But I'm the only one that's going to be. I'm the one that's what I have to influence those.
Yeah.
So I look at it that way. I'm very likes to tell us how bad of a life
Wow.
he likes to quite free. I admit that. So I take courage. God loves that. All of us need courage. Our presence, not just for myself.
Oh, that's very well said. Yes. I remember years ago, that whispering of, you're not good enough. I was in high school, and I think very, very, very weak Christian, and I'd gone out that weekend and done something. I can't remember what it was, but I know I felt guilty about it. And I thought, I don't know if I, had gotten drinking or done something, and I did not feel like I should be in church. I felt, man, I really messed up. But I went to church anyway. And that congregation, they had their worship first, and then they had class. I think they may have had 2 services or something, but I did not stay for class. I mean, it was all I could do just to be there. I thought, I felt like a fraud, and I wasn't serving. And I came home, and my stepmother, who was a non-Christian at the time, sadly she died a non-Christian, but she was very hostile to Christians. And she seized upon that, and she said, I could hear her under her breath telling my dad as I came in, because I came home early. And she said, you're home early? And as I was coming into the next room, a few minutes later, I heard her say to my dad, he only goes to church for the social reasons. Huh? So you got a weak Christian that's struggling already, and you got a non-Christian going, you're not good enough. Right? And man, it had an effect. The devil whispers in our ear, doesn't he? You're not good enough. And I think especially in our older years, because we can't go back and fix it. If you're young, you think, well, I've got, a lifetime ahead of me. But when you're older, you don't. And, sometimes we live with the consequences. I know a preacher who, he had an affair and had multiple affairs. He married someone that was not, he left his wife and married the person. And toward the very end of his life, on his deathbed, he was able to reconcile with his kids. They forgave him, And he said that he had prayed to the Lord. Let's see how he said it. I told the Lord, I know I've hurt a lot of people, and I prayed to God to forgive me. And then he said, I'm ready to die. And he did. He died shortly after that. But we cannot allow our failings in the past to prevent us from staying faithful to the Lord. And the winter years are so, I think, fragile in some ways, because we do sometimes feel like that. Another quality, I think, of going into the winter year is depending on others. We do not like to depend on other people. We like to be the provider and the helper and the person that, we take care of ourselves, especially if you've, served in the church or served in some role. The idea of allowing other people to take care of us as we get near the end of our life is appalling. We don't like that. But I want us to think about, just briefly, what are some of the good things that come from that? You think about somebody on their deathbed, and they have physical limitations, and maybe it lingers for a bit. What one quality can you think of that comes from that? What was it? Yeah, that was the very one I was thinking of. Humility. There's no real shame. When my dad got real sick, and they didn't have any more depends or anything like that. They just had a mat, and they let him sort of, just do what he did, and they would clean up after him. And there was no shame in that, because he was at the end of his life. We develop humility when we can't do for ourselves. The thought of having somebody pay our bills for us, because we can no longer really manage. That's not a quality that we think is good, and yet, man, something comes from that, and that is maybe humility and a dependence on the Lord. I want us to look, if we can, at 2 Corinthians chapter 12. I heard a fellow say one time, he said, you don't know how good a son-in-law you have until he puts your clothing on for you. Yeah? Second Corinthians chapter 12. Okay, so this is where Paul he's defending his apostleship. You remember he had some apostles that were pretty wicked and sort of, not apostles, but people in the church that were, accusing him of being a false prophet or false apostle. And so he defends that. And one of the things he uses as a defense is, look at all the hardship I've been through. Would I do this? Would I go through all these hardships if I were not a true apostle? Because it would have been much easier just to quit. And so he makes this defense in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He said, must I go on boasting? Although there is nothing to be gained, I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up into the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, he's speaking of himself, I think in the third person, right? Whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up into paradise. He heard inexpressible things a man is not permitted to tell. Whenever I hear somebody that says they died and they went to heaven and this is what they saw and this is how it's going to be, that's not true. Because the Apostle Paul was not permitted to tell what he saw in heaven. For whatever reason, the Lord doesn't allow us to know those things. And so that's suspect if somebody says, I saw this and this happens in heaven. We do not know. Verse 5, I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself except about my weaknesses. So he's about to take pride in all of his weaknesses. Verse 6, even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain, so no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say. To keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassing great revelations, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. That is the most powerful statement, that our power is stronger in weakness. Now, how can that be? How can I be stronger? Yes, sir. That's right. When I'm depending on myself, I'm weak, aren't I? And the world looks at a person who's strong physically or strong, emotionally or wealthy or whatever, and they think, man, that is somebody. But Paul is using the exact opposite approach, isn't he? He says, when I'm weak, that's when I'm dependent on the Lord. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses. He delights in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. strong. I don't think that way. Do you? I mean, I don't say I'm glad when I'm weak. But I think when we approach the end of our life, we realize really how futile in some ways this life has been. All the money in the world doesn't mean a thing. And all the popularity, you can be the most beautiful person in the world, and when you're on your deathbed, that means nothing. I heard a story about one of our presidents. I won't say who he was, but he was a very ambitious president and very corrupt, and he was on his deathbed. And I may have told you this story, but he was talking to his daughter, and he said, I feel like I've let you down. I've missed out on so much. And she said, well, you were there when I graduated from school. You were there when I got married. You were there. He said, you were there for the big things in my life. You were there. And he said, but I missed a lot of the little things. Now, this is a president of the United States, somebody who could, at the command of just about anything, have an airplane at his disposal. He knew people with money. He could have anything that he wanted instantly, probably. And yet, none of that meant anything now. The only thing that mattered was I missed the piano recital. I missed out on what really mattered in life. And I think in our older years, that is also a tool of Satan. If we're not careful, we look back with regret. And we mustn't do that because, as Paul would say, when I'm weak, that's when I'm strong. I'm depending on the Lord. In spite of my failings, I can still be a mentor to people, and I can still have strength because my strength comes from God, not me. And when our strength is in ourselves, when we're at the end of our life, we're in despair because it's failing. But if our hope and strength is in the Lord, then we have reason to be happy, even if this life is failing us. Remember, Paul said, I'm wasting away outwardly, but inwardly being renewed day by day. That is the beauty of being a follower of the Lord. We have renewal that takes place. I think we're close to the end. Anybody have anything they want to say? Yes, sir.
Failing of others, older age, not an indictment.
That's right. That's so true.
I believe Elijah, he successfully defended God and not Carmel. Absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
Not it. And so I guess you understand. Anything rejected God.
Yeah.
It's not a failure. He was successful.
Yes. Yeah, we think that we're saving, the generation to come. Well, we're not. We're serving the Lord right now. We have right now. We don't have any guarantee of tomorrow, and our effect on the world may not go that far, right? It may just be our present life that we're influencing those around us, and that's good enough. The Lord, I think, was very pleased with Elijah, even though maybe the children of Israel failed. Good thoughts. Well, if you don't have anything else, I guess we'll be finished. Thanks.